Good afternoon. You were critical in bringing this matter to light. What are your thoughts? What were your thoughts hearing that in the Commons?
Very emotional, very moved. I shed a tear this morning because I was thinking of the people that I met in Kenya and Tanzania, in villages where they lost their sons, some of them voluntarily, but many of them were just commandeered into the African riflemen, or they were carriers who carried British troops and goods across East Africa. And when they lost their sons, they didn't know where they were buried. And those villages and towns were devastated, as you would expect, for years to come because they lost all their men. And so on their behalf, I thought this is a really important moment.
Because that blank space where there should have been not just private memorial, but public memorial of these men, and some women as well, no doubt. We had that filled, didn't we? The rest of us had that filled, I suppose. Even those of us who didn't have a strong family connection to those who served. It's part of the fabric of our national life, isn't it? And you're talking there about just a blank space instead.
Oh, look, we've got so much. I mean, we've got Men in Gate in Belgium, school trips every year across the country to Belgium and France to look at those gravesites and think about the First World War. We've got the poetry of Wilfred Owen, Rudyard Kipling, and so many others. We even have fantastic popular culture like the Blackadder series. But, you know, the interesting thing is the First World War did not begin on the Western Front, Sheila. We never learned that the first shots were fired on the Eastern Front in East Africa, and that there were African soldiers, Egyptian, Middle Eastern soldiers who fought for the British Empire and died for the British Empire. Every single culture honours its dead, particularly in war. And what I found in Kenya were mass graves, sometimes where Africans were dumped with no plaque at all to commemorate them. So there was a very different treatment for black and brown people at that time. And I think the issue is not just this was 100 years ago and correcting that wrong. It's that it's gone on for so long. It took a documentary and the work of Professor Michelle Barrett to really break this open. And even then, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission really didn't enter the fray with this report until my documentary. So it does leave us with some big questions, really, about how we recognise these, our history and honour our history and honour all of those, whatever the colour of their skin, and their stories.
And what will it amount to? I don't mean the moral of it and the future knowledge of it. We'll come on to that in a sec. But what will it amount to in those mounds that you found, in those villages that you visited? Will there be the equivalent, the local equivalent of the kinds of cenotaph type memorials that we see?
Well, there was a phrase that was used in the documentation from British administrators where they sent names missing, or they would allow graves to return to nature, which means that there are names in the archives in Kenya and Tanzania, and those names can now be found, and those memorials can now be put up where those names exist. But of course, there will be, I'm afraid, thousands and thousands of names that are missing. And there, I think that we can enter into conversations with local communities about how they want to commemorate, and that will be different in different places. When I was in Voi in Kenya, they said they wanted a museum. There, their dead was sitting outside the established Commonwealth War Graves Commission, where there are Europeans buried. The African dead were effectively in the bush just outside it. They said, we want a museum. If you can help us build something where we can just celebrate the fact that we participated, that's all we need. So
that's interesting, isn't it?
Different places will be different.
Of course, and oral history is so important. You know, yes, you want the formal history. Yes, you want the documented history, but oral history, even in a family, the talking about the dead keeps them alive, doesn't it? Keeps their story alive, keeps their spirit alive. And I can see why that would be a real driver for communities. I mean, it is for us, isn't it? It is here. Going back to what you touched on there about what we know, what we don't know, is now the time for a change in how we teach our children in this country about those key, relatively recent dates in our own history?
Well, you know, we've also, haven't we, Sheila, had these vexed debates in the last few weeks about race and racism. Well, this is it. This is what institutional racism looks like. There is no better example than this and its consequences.
And can I interrupt there? Can I interrupt there? And because do you mean? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but people hear terms like structural racism and institutional racism and don't necessarily break it down into the nuts and bolts of the reality of what that means. Structural racism, institutional racism means the powerful get to decide whose story is told. The powerful get to decide who is listened to. The powerful get to decide where the emphasis is.
Sheila, you put it very well. And so this isn't about an individual act. This is about a collective act. And that collective act means that young people over generations, including you and I, Sheila, do not know this story. And when people talk today about decolonizing the curriculum, it's a fancy phrase, but they're really about saying, can we shine a light on these stories and bring them to the foreground in our schools and our universities? So this is a really good petri dish example of what that debate is about and how necessary it is. Now, of course, it's the toughest of examples because it's about death and dignity and service and honour and glory and pain. But nevertheless, this is an example of a very timely debate that we're having. And we've got to get better at just being honest about our history, warts and all.